Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the May 2023 edition of Epic Insight. This is Joe Corona. I'm the Director of Sales and Strategic Partnerships at Epic Retirement Plan Services, and I will be the host for today's call. Will ERISA court cases ever slow down? Employers and plans of all sizes are vulnerable. While we can't stop a claim from being brought onto a plan sponsor, there are many effective plays plan sponsors and their advisors can make to help potentially ward off a suit. During this session, we will examine recent court cases, what we can learn from them, and share a checklist advisors can use to strengthen their conversations with plan sponsors. With that in mind, we're excited to have joining us Rob Duffy from Invesco. Rob serves as a Vice President and Senior Retirement Plan Consultant at Invesco. As a 20-plus year veteran of the industry, Rob is responsible for managing the DCIO relationships for the New England territory. He collaborates with financial professionals to help find innovative solutions to retirement plan challenges and helps advisors grow their business to meet the investment needs of an increasingly complex retirement marketplace. Your line will be muted throughout the call, but if you have any questions that you would like addressed at the end of the session, we ask that you enter them into the webinar control panel, and we will address them at the end of the session. And with that, I will turn it over to Rob.
Thanks, Joe, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us on a Thursday before a long weekend. And Joe, you hit on it. That's the question, is will they ever stop? It seems like every week we're reading about a suit being brought or a suit being settled, and we're seeing lots of kind of opinions start to form from the courts. And a big question that I get in addition to that is, how likely am I to be sued? And to maybe nip that question early on, while yes, large employers are certainly more of the focus of the suits, the things that we're going to talk about today is more of the lessons learned, so those fiduciary best practices, because your role or a plan sponsor's role as a fiduciary has nothing to do with the size of their business or the size of the plan. So there's a lot that we can learn from the suits, regardless of whether or not we think that risk of being sued is real for a particular plan. I really want to focus in on some of those best practices. So in our time here together, we're going to hit on a couple of things. A quick recap of just kind of the basics of the duties of an ERISA fiduciary. And then we'll dig into a couple of examples of some of the cases that we've seen. I will tell you, I'm not an attorney. Some people think that's a good thing, but there's a lot that we can distill and learn from what we're seeing in terms of that activity, particularly from the plaintiff's attorneys. And then what do we do with this all? I'll quickly kind of end by highlighting a checklist that we've developed as a result of these suits to try to bring those to our clients and our plan sponsors to try to implement some of these best practices. So let's jump right in. We know that as ERISA fiduciaries, everything that we do and decisions that we make must be made in the best interest of plan participants and their beneficiaries. So that's kind of the overarching guiding principle that all of us as fiduciaries must be following. But there's these kind of 5 tenets that capture most of what's involved in being a plan fiduciary, and these are also most of the areas that are referenced when we see some of the suits being brought. So we know that there's a duty of prudence, right? That we must act with the care and the skill to administer the plan and make decisions around the plan, again, in the interest of participants and beneficiaries. But there's also a duty to recognize that if I, as a fiduciary, might lack a certain level of expertise in the area, it's my duty to go out and seek that and hire the experts to help me in managing that fiduciary responsibility. We know that it's incredibly important to follow plan documents, and the lawsuits key in on this frequently. And so it's not just what people think of as their plan document, the adoption agreement or the basic plan document, but it could be other documents that the plan and its fiduciaries or committee members and boards have created, things like investment policy statements. The courts have ruled that while those are good practices in creating those documents, those oftentimes are viewed as plan documents. So while it could be a great practice, one of the importance is if you're going to create documents saying that you're going to do certain things, make sure that you're following those, because participants. Again, we're seeing, and I'll give some examples of suits that said, hey, you didn't do what you said you were going to do as it relates to administering this plan. We need to avoid conflicts of interest and prohibited transactions, and that could be maybe the way that we're structuring multiple plans or multiple offerings that we might be getting from our service providers. We need to make sure that, again, we're making decisions not based on what might be the most affordable or the easiest, but truly what's in the best interest of participants. We'll hit on diversification. We're seeing that come up in suits as well, which really is centered around the investments, but allowing people to have choice so that they can manage the amount of risk that they're taking on and minimize the potential for losses. And then, of course, kind of that exclusive purpose rule of making sure that the way in which we administer benefits, the costs associated with those benefits, is all done in the best interest of participants and beneficiaries for their exclusive purpose. So quick recap on kind of those main pillars. The big thing that we've learned is what matters most is process. So we kind of pound our fists on this one, process, but that's what the courts are looking for. Yes, hindsight is 20/20, but we don't know what the future holds. But what we can control as planned fiduciaries when we administer benefits is the process that we undergo when we make decisions. Who are we going to hire if we bring in a service provider? What types of due diligence are we going to conduct in making those decisions? So it's important that we have a process, because the courts, if that's challenged, is going to want to know what steps we took to make decisions as it relates to the plan. And a big thing that goes with process is documenting that process. Because if I don't do that, how does anybody know what my process really was? Or how can I prove that I had a process, that I did due diligence, that there was a method to my madness? And while people want to and like to focus on outcome, and outcome's important, but what the courts have made clear is what's far more important is the process that we take and the documentation so that we can illustrate and prove the process. So we put this quote at the bottom, which actually came from one of the court opinions, that a pure heart and an empty head are not enough. So yes, outcome matters, but it's all about process. It's all about documentation. It's kind of those bookends that we want to see and make sure that fiduciaries are following. We also like to remind fiduciaries, and we don't say this as a scare tactic, but there can be consequences for those breaches. While it seems dated, it seems like it happened, and it did, a couple of decades ago, the Enron case, which some of you may recall or be familiar with, where, Ken Lay was CEO of Enron and part of the fiduciary committee overseeing their retirement plans, was subject to both civil and criminal liability. His homes were seized, his yachts were seized. There was significant penalty involved with those fiduciary breaches. So while those aren't necessarily common, they can certainly happen. And we like to remind folks that the regulators do have that ability to both apply civil and criminal liability where they see fiduciary breaches. So it's something to certainly take seriously. And then we've learned that there's these often kind of easily overlooked aspects to being a fiduciary, in some cases hiring a fiduciary. So we kind of think of the retirement plan, in this case I put a defined contribution plan kind of being the center of the orbit here. And it's very common that if I'm a plan fiduciary, if I'm a business owner and I want to establish or make a change to my retirement plan, I'm going to, think about my record keeper. I'm going to do some assessment, probably go out and collect some proposals, do an RFP, and do my due diligence, my process of selecting and monitoring that record keeper, and I'll probably document that one. So that one's commonly followed usually. Areas that we see that may not be followed as often would be something like hiring an investment fiduciary. Some of you listening in may act as investment fiduciaries, either 321 or 338s, but sometimes those services are built in to the offering that might come from a record keeper. But when you hire an investment fiduciary, a 321 or a 338, you are hiring an advice provider, and usually doing so at a cost to the plan and a cost to plan participants. So it's equally important to conduct due diligence. And in cases where maybe that is an embedded offering from our record keeper, it doesn't absolve us from the need to still go through a process of conducting that due diligence and documenting that process. So it might be that I look at other investment fiduciaries available in the marketplace to at least start to document that, yes, I did pay attention, and the one that's offered by my record keeper, the one that's offered by my advisor makes sense, and here's why. So if I'm ever questioned as to why I have that investment fiduciary, I can start to illustrate and prove the process that I went through in hiring them. Same with managed accounts, which are getting a lot of traction in the marketplace right now. And in some cases might make a lot of sense for the plan. I'll touch on a suit that we saw around this in a little bit, but equally important that you're hiring that advice provider. It's coming at a cost to the plan and participants. So we need to show that we're conducting our due diligence. Some that are frequently overlooked, something like a self-directed brokerage option. There's different opinions. We'll actually touch briefly on a case that involved self-directed brokerage. But if you have clients that like that feature, again, it might be an embedded provision in the offering from your record keeper, or depending on how you're designing your plan, doesn't absolve us to going to the market, doing some due diligence, looking at what's out there. And then finally, the auto IRA cash out option for those low balance, kind of the sweeping out those low balances of former and terminated employees. Are we doing due diligence? Are we documenting? So those are some of the ones that we see getting overlooked out there, but it can be important to not kind of create that smoking gun that somebody might question down the road. The other thing that's coming up a lot lately, as you all know, we're seeing a lot of consolidation in our industry at every level, among record keepers, among asset managers, among consultants. And when there's a change due to acquisition, really what we should be doing as plan fiduciaries is then going to market, going through maybe another RFP process so that we can do that analysis to make sure that my new provider, who I was kind of moved over to through acquisition, continues to fit the needs and make sense for my plan. So if I started out with provider A, who I did due diligence on 5 years ago, and provider A gets acquired by provider B, I should actually take that as an opportunity to go to market, make sure that provider B is going to fit my needs. So let's dig in and look at a couple of cases that we've seen out there. I lumped these two together because they both kind of were centered around the ongoing duty to monitor plan investments. So Tibble v. Edison was one that originally said, well, do I fall under as a fiduciary the statute of limitations? So maybe I won't be kind of on the hook for failing to monitor plan investments. And the courts have made it very clear that as fiduciaries, we have this ongoing duty that kind of keeps resetting the clock to monitor plan investments. In Hughes Northwestern, Judge Sotomayor used the word all, the duty to monitor all plan investments. So I kind of bolded that on the screen. The reason I did so is we're seeing some plaintiffs' attorneys, firms like Schlichter, who's involved with many of these cases, start to key in on the use of that word all. And what we're keeping an eye on is, what does all encompass? Might that include things like self-directed brokerage accounts, which previously haven't really been viewed as plan investments that fiduciaries need to monitor? But if that all word gets keyed in on, does that open a new Pandora's box where there's a larger universe of investment offerings that plan sponsors need to make sure that they're monitoring? So something to keep an eye on as we move forward in this environment. George v. Kraft, and this kind of highlighted that need to benchmark. I mentioned earlier, one of those fiduciary tenets in offering benefits is to make sure that they're offered at a reasonable price. And this was a plan that was with Fidelity, and Fidelity came to the employer one day and said, hey, good news, we're going to reduce your fee. And the employer was thankful for that, but didn't take a step to benchmark or kind of look at the market to say, well, is that fee reasonable? Good that it's going down, but is it in line with the marketplace? And in fact, it was viewed that it was not. And a suit was brought claiming that that fiduciary failed their duty to benchmark and monitor fees. So even though it seems like things are moving in a good direction, you still need to spot check that once in a while and make sure that you're in line with the marketplace and your fees are reasonable. Tussey ABB looked at the use of revenue sharing. Again, this was a Fidelity, and this is not picking on Fidelity. They're just a big record keeper, and they work in a market that's kind of more prone to some of these suits. So this was another Fidelity plan, but this employer had multiple plans. They had a defined contribution plan, a defined benefit plan. They were also getting some payroll services from Fidelity. And what was happening is that some of the revenue that was being generated from the defined contribution plan was being used to offset the costs associated with some of those other services. And one of the issues became payroll. So payroll is not a planned expense. We can't pay for or offset the costs associated with payroll using revenue generated from the retirement plan. And so it's really important that if revenue is being used within a plan, that a fiduciary has an understanding of how that's being used, where that's going, and that it's being used for that exclusive purpose of that particular retirement plan. So important to be mindful of revenue sharing. And again, we'll see different aspects of revenue in another case that I'll touch on here shortly. Hecker v. Deere, again, another Fidelity case, but this one challenged the use of proprietary funds, and the plan participants said, hey, we've got all these Fidelity funds in our plan, and it seems like this isn't well suited to the needs of participants, and it's too proprietary. A lot of people tend to worry about self-directed brokerage. In this case, the court said, hey, participants, your plan has a self-directed brokerage provision, so you can really invest in any number of investments. So while the core lineup of your plan might feel proprietary and limited, because of self-directed brokerage, you have the option to invest in a much wider universe. So that was kind of their get out of jail free card in the case of self-directed brokerage with Hecker Deere. Anderson v. Intel. The Intel plan was actually creating customized target date funds for their plan, and in doing so, it had included some private equity, they had included some hedge funds, and the way that they were benchmarking and monitoring those customized target date funds was using some just very basic standard market indices, things like the S&P and the AG. And the suit said that because you're using private equity, something happened, Joe, to my presentation, I apologize. There we go. Because they were using private equity and hedge funds, they should have created a customized benchmark. So if this is something that you found that you might be doing in your practice, or if you've seen clients doing this, well, it's perfectly fine to create a custom target date fund. If you're doing that, you have to make sure that you are monitoring that appropriately and benchmarking that against a relative benchmark or relevant benchmark. And then Barnett versus Alight. So Alight's the old Hewitt, which some of you may know or be familiar with. And this was around cyber and fraud. And there were some participants who had suffered losses from their accounts. There had been some money removed from the accounts from fraud. And so the suit originally named Abbott Labs, as well as the members of the Abbott Lab Retirement Plan Committee, along with Alight, their record keeper, their plan provider. And the courts dismissed Abbott because Abbott was able to show that they had a process, a documented process around monitoring and evaluating the cyber provisions that came from Alight as it related to their plan and their plan participants. So the fact that they could show that process and that documentation around their process got the plan sponsor and the committee members dismissed from the suit. Alight was not dismissed. And we've seen a few cases around Alight and some cyber issues, and so there's some ongoing investigations as it relates to that. But cyber was certainly one of the things that we're keeping an eye on going forward, knowing that there's so many attempted hacks going on, because the hackers know that retirement plans are a large asset for most people, and one that is not often monitored to the extent that it probably should be. So when I speak about these topics, I often challenge people that if you were to lose your wallet or your purse, would it be top of mind to call your record keeper on your retirement plan to let them know about that? Because you've got a lot of your personally identifiable information that might be contained in your wallet. It might allow somebody to start to make attempts at hacking and getting into your retirement savings account. So that's definitely something that we're keeping an eye on going forward. A big one and a more recent one was Riker v. Juniper. And we hit on a few things here that I think kind of tie together a lot of these fiduciary issues that we've been touching on. So the first claim was that their record-keeping fees were not reasonable. And what we're seeing more recently from these plaintiffs' attorneys is they are going out and they're kind of scraping and getting data from 5500s, from audit reports, all things that are publicly available and accessible, and saying, okay, you Juniper Networks have a plan that's of a certain size and scope in terms of assets and participants. I'm going to go out and look at 12, 15, 20 different employers that are similar in size to you that have cheaper fees. And so if I'm scouring through hundreds of plans, it's probably not hard for me to find, in this case, 16 comparator plans that appear to be cheaper. So we'll touch on that one in a little bit. It also claimed that I had expensive share classes. We're going to touch on revenue when we looked at that one, but it also brought up the idea of the active versus passive debate. The suit alleged that I had too many actively managed funds. I should have had more passive index options in my plan. It suggested that my managed account fees were unreasonable and they couldn't show that they were actually adding value, going back to process and documentation. There were some issues around their fee disclosure, their 408B2s and their 404A5s. In the case of the 404A5 going to participants, some errors in the fee disclosure that weren't picked up on by the fiduciaries. And because all of these other things were going wrong, or were going poorly and going wrong, clearly there was a failure on the part of the board to monitor the plan committees and make sure that they were paying attention to all of these things. So digging in quickly, as it relates to expensive share classes, the plan was offering, and this actually was taken right from the suit, small cap value fund A, which they were using an R6 share class, so a share class that had no revenue share involved and had a total expense ratio of 79 basis points. The suit alleged that they should have used the A share class of that fund with a total expense of 113 basis points. And it claimed that because the A share included a 50 basis point revenue share. So when you net that out, your net cost on the A share was 63 basis points versus the 79 basis points. Now, this opens the door to talk about revenue share. Some people love it, some people hate it. The takeaway here is, did they have a process and did they document the fact that they even considered or thought about using or not using revenue sharing? That you can make a case to not use it because crediting back and utilizing revenue sharing can be a complex, error-prone process. But if you feel as though it's being done well and it makes sense, you can make a case for using revenue sharing, but they didn't consider it at all, which was the problem they had with this suit. The idea about expensive and inappropriate share classes, so the active passive option, again, this information was taken directly from the suit as well. On the left-hand side, we had funds that were offered by Juniper. And so you've got some actively managed funds, small mid-value, world large stock, et cetera. And it listed out the expense ratio of each of those options. And you can see that's held the defendant's investment. And then on the right, again, taken from the court case, is what they call the prudent alternative. And as you can see, it was a list of index funds that were much lower in cost. And you can see on the far right, the difference in cost between the plan's offerings and the quote unquote prudent offering that was alleged. Now, when you drop in the balances in those funds and you kind of carry that out over the years that were captured in the suit, and you total that up, you'll notice in bright red on the lower right-hand side, damage or alleged damage of $21 million. This is a number that will get the attention of courts. Now, what's not included on the screen, you're all muted, but I will say, what don't you see in this claim is anything other than expense. No consideration of performance, which could be a big thing when comparing investment options and saying, was something prudent or not? But there's no consideration of anything other than expense. And so here, showing the importance of what was the process behind selecting and monitoring and choosing those planned investment options. Now, I will move on quickly for time's sake to how do we start to use this? So looking at these cases, we have created, and we can share with Joe and share with all of you, a checklist to start to work with clients, work with fiduciaries to start to show that we can review these items and start to build that documented process. So around governance, are we conducting fiduciary training? Actually, this presentation is approved for use with plan sponsors and can be part of a fiduciary training program. Are we, taking meeting minutes as we're getting together with plan sponsors and committees? Are we putting our plans out to bid, every 5 or so years, and are we documenting that RFP or that RFI process as part of our ongoing duty to monitor? When it comes to investments, can I articulate what my investment process is, my hiring and my firing and my monitoring process? I mentioned revenue sharing. Have I made an active decision to use or not use revenue, but can I document and show that there was some consideration that went into that? We're seeing, a lot of growth in the use of things like collective trusts. So I thought about the use of CITs over mutual funds, for example, documenting that process. Plan fees. One, do I understand them? Am I reviewing my 408B2s and my 404A5s, but are those correct? Are there errors in there? Around plan documentation, do I have maybe some cyber policies? Have I thought about that? Have I had conversations with my service provider about the process that would go on if we were to have a cyber issue or a fraud issue? Am I building out my fiduciary file? What about my plan communications? If I've made a change to my plan, how am I communicating that to participants? And am I potentially creating an issue if I say, our old plan had horrible fees, it was overpriced and poorly designed, but we've got this great new plan. Well, now I'm admitting that I had a plan that was overpriced and horribly designed. So it's important to be careful of the language that we use in plan participant communications. So again, happy to share that, but I know we've got a couple of minutes left. So if there are questions, I am happy to tackle some questions as well, if there's anything in the chat, Joe.
Absolutely. So one of the questions that came in was, more of a comment is obviously the devil is in the details, right? It's the documentation and making sure that plan sponsors maintain adequate records of the processes that they're following is so very important to maintaining an effective retirement plan, and it's evident in these court cases. So if you could touch on some of that, Rob, as it relates to plan documentation and committee charters and so on.
Yeah, so again, process and documentation is the crux of it all. Because without the documentation, how can I prove what my process was and what that looked like? So if I'm challenged, that's the importance of documentation. I think what we've learned from the courts is, while it's incredibly important, we don't necessarily all either want to be overly detailed. So if we get together, say quarterly, semi-annually, or even just annually to do a plan review, let's document what we talked about. If we're doing an investment review, let's put some notes together saying we talked about things, or maybe it continued to meet the needs of our plan. If we put something on watch, we kind of make some notations around what we did around that or around fees. You'll see some plans start to document education initiatives that they're doing with their employees, so that we start to have a history of providing education and guidance there for every challenge. So yeah, I think meeting notes are a big one. If there's a board that oversees a plan committee, where we've seen some issues is failure of the committee to report back up to the board. So in that Juniper Networks case, again, it said the board wasn't paying attention because otherwise all of these issues wouldn't have happened. So kind of periodically, if there's a board overseeing a committee, make sure that once a year you put a couple of slides together and report back up to the committee. But yeah, documentation is a big one.
One other question related to, you mentioned obviously the consolidation that is taking place within our industry in all facets, whether you're looking at advisory firms, record-keeping firms. Could you talk about that recommendation about for a plan sponsor that's really a cue to then revisit all that you are doing with your retirement plan, who is interacting with you on the retirement plan and the services that you're being provided, and that could be the kickoff to putting a plan potentially out to bid or an RFP, or to really dig into that new partner that might be coming into play because of an acquisition or a merger.
Yeah, and again, that's a big one because to your point, Joe, we've seen a lot of it in every aspect of this business. But um, again, I look at it as though if someone were to ask me, if a participant were to challenge me as a plan sponsor, as a fiduciary, why I did something, I need to have an answer. I need to prove it, right? And so if 10 years ago I chose provider A, I put my plan out to bid, I collected proposals, I had them all come in and present. I said provider A makes all the sense in the world. And at the time I documented that, right? I put the proposals, my comparisons in a file, and I was good to go. 10 years later, provider A gets acquired by B, and I'm along for the ride. But if somebody says, well, why am I at provider B? I have no documented process. I can't say I firmly chose B. My answer is, well, B bought A, right? Which is not going to be sufficient in the court size. So, yeah, when we see this consolidation, whether it's a record keeper, an asset manager, an advisory firm, it's really a good best practice to take that as an opportunity to reassess your new provider on whatever aspect that may be. So if it's a record keeping scenario, putting my plan maybe out to bid and doing an RFP or an RFI to look at the marketplace, assess the options available to me, and see if my new record keeper makes sense for my business. If it does, I can now document the fact that I went through that exercise. Same with changes on my investment lineup. If my mutual fund company got acquired and now I'm with a new mutual fund company, was there an impact to that investment that I need to reconsider, or my advisory firm? So kind of just going along for the ride is not a good answer in the court size.
Well, thank you, Rob. And that wraps up the questions for today. We would like to thank Rob Duffy from Invesco, and thank you all for joining us for this Epic Insight webinar. As a reminder, we will be sending out a copy of today's presentation and a recording of the session as a follow-up. And as always, we wish you safety and health as you help support your families, colleagues, and clients. Please don't hesitate to contact us if there's anything that Epic Retirement Plan Services or our colleagues at Invesco can do to support you and your efforts. And we thank you, and we look forward to having you join us for an upcoming edition of Epic Insight. Thank you.
Thanks all.